Influences of developments in religious belief, life after death. This presentation focuses on the first of two parts of this section. This is the life after death part, and the final presentation will be on religion and science. In order to understand this topic well, we need to understand what it is that our focus is. What is the question that we're asking? We're discussing here two things: the mind, or sometimes we're also using the term soul, and the body. So this is the argument between whether or not our mind and our body are one entity, or whether they are separate entities. So this is discussing whether we are made up of one thing or at least two things. There are a number of different terms that we can explore and look at to talk about this, but these are the main ones that we're going to focus on. We're going to look at dualism, monism. We're going to look at substance dualism, as this relates to a key scholar called Descartes, and materialism. And the question that this raises, the implication, if you like, regarding the self, is to consider whether the mind and the body are actually separate. And what is the impact of this conversation on who we are, on our identity, on the self? And at this point, it's worth just pausing and reflecting on that very thing. This topic can enjoy exploring: who am I? What's my identity? What makes me me? Is it my body? Is it my personality, my emotions? Therefore, is it my mind? Is it a soul that I have that I can identify as the part that animates me, as Aristotle put it? And we're going to explore a few key philosophers who help us make sense of some of these questions. In a seminar setting, we could have a great debate about whether, for example, if you had Alzheimer's and you were losing your memory, if you were believing that your identity is your mind, then are you losing yourself? Are you no longer you? Do you no longer exist if your mind deteriorates? Is now only part of you, you? And these sorts of questions also have implications for things like the resurrection, which we will look at as well. And there are also a range of implications that come along when we think about our identity being in our body. You know, the link between the body and the mind. If we drink alcohol or take drugs, our mind is altered and affected, and it also affects our body. And if our mind was completely separate from our body, then we would act completely the same if we took alcohol or if we took drugs. When our body changes, our mind would remain intact. But this doesn't seem to be the case. So let's have a look at some of the key terms then. So dualism, you will need to talk about. We are a combination of two different aspects: the mind, or in some cases we might say the soul, and the body. Substance dualism is to make a distinction between two types or three types of dualism. The two main ones are substance and property. We're going to focus just on substance dualism because I'm going to discuss Descartes. And he was a substance dualist. Humans are made of a combination of two substances. It's very straightforward. The substance of the mind and the substance of the body. And we'll explore this with Descartes a little bit later. Monism is when we are not made up of two different aspects, but the belief is we are made up of one thing. And materialism takes the view that we are, like monism, made up of one thing, but it's one substance that is physical. And it is the same regardless of whether or not we're talking about the mind and the body. If we're talking about the mind, we're really talking about something which is just physical, indistinguishable from the body. So let's talk about Plato. Plato is one of the more complicated scholars that we will look at. He was the student of Socrates. He also wrote what we know of Socrates down. He argued that the soul was a simple substance with no parts and was indestructible. That means it was immortal. From the outset, it's really clear that you need to know Plato was a dualist. He believed that the soul and the body were separate. In the early dialogues of Phaedo, where we find him wrestling with his ideas about the body and the soul and their relationship, he initially believed that conflict was only between the soul and the body. Any tension that we have, within ourselves, it was, between the body and the soul. And it wasn't between different parts of the soul. Now, this is because for Plato, the soul is who you are. And so earlier on, he made this point that who you are is sitting external to your body, and therefore that's what you have tension with. However, he included a bit later on another element to the soul. And this is because it dawned on him that how can you ever truly be in conflict with yourself, wrestling with things that you are dealing with, if you are just your soul and actually your body is not who you really are. And so he had to add a few elements to the soul in order to demonstrate how it is that we're able to have these moments of tension within ourselves when we wrestle with who we are, torn between what is right and what is wrong, whether I should be angry or whether I should be peaceful, what should I do? And so he came up with 3 elements to the soul, and you can see it here in his analogy of the charioteer. He says that the soul is split into the higher soul, which would be the reason. In the charioteer analogy, it's the man there whipping the horses, making sure that they don't go wild and off-piste, but keeping some order and stability to the soul. Then there's the lower part of the soul, which is the appetites or the desires and the emotions. And then you've got the third part of the soul, which is the will, your spirit. And this should always side with reason, not with the appetites. And so this was Plato's idea of what the soul was and who we are as people. He saw the soul as becoming this state that is governed by reason. And if reason isn't governing your soul and it's your lower soul, your appetites, then it's tyranny that is ruling your soul. So in the analogy of the charioteer, in Phaedrus explaining these things, you've got the obedient white horse, which is the will, the spirit. You've got the unruly dark horse, which is the other horse next to it. And that is your appetites that need reining in. And then you've got the charioteer, who is the reason that ties it together. Now, Plato also had some theories alongside his beliefs of dualism and the soul. And the first thing to argue with Plato is that he believed in the immortality of the soul. Now, that means that your soul lives on after death. So if you have a question that's asking you to evaluate the immortality of the soul, here you're able to use Plato to debate and discuss and put forward the argument that there is indeed life after death. Now, he comes to this argument in a very simple way, using his theory of opposites. He simply pointed out that everything in existence has an opposite to it. So, for example, something is big because something is small. In the same way, he believed that something is living and something is dead. And if you look at your body, since that is mortal, which means it will die eventually, it will cease to exist, then its opposite is immortality, that there is a part of you that will live on forever. Now, for example, that is therefore the soul, which is indestructible and opposite. So he used his theory of opposites to say, very simply, that there's a part of you that lives on after your bodily death. The next theory is the theory of recollection. Now, this is where we start to really get into some of the heart and meat of Plato. He believed some interesting things. That the soul came into this world, your soul came into this world, and it had knowledge from a previous life in a disembodied state. Now, if you're disembodied, that means that you don't have a body. So you were floating around, your soul was floating around in a different place, a different state. Now, Meno, who is a character in Plato's dialogues, gives an example of a slave boy with knowledge of mathematical proofs. And this is Plato's reasoning, that here's evidence right now of someone who had knowledge of something way beyond his age, and it's clearly come from another place. So Plato concluded that our soul is immortal and eternal, and it used to exist before this world in a different world, a world inhabited of ideas. And he called this the world of the forms. It's a perfect world. And before your birth, he believes that you're yearning to return back to that realm after death, because that's where your soul's true home is. Now, this world in which you live isn't the true reality. It's a bit of a distortion. And so we only see elements or variations of the forms in this world. It's almost like a fabrication or an imitation. And we recognize those through the process of recollection. In other words, your soul never learns anything new in this world. Instead, it is simply remembering or recollecting things from its past existence in the world of the forms. So you can never really learn anything new. In fact, what you're learning now is just you simply remembering what you already knew. But because of the trauma of childbirth, Plato believed that your soul had that trauma and it repressed those memories. Plato believed that all genuine knowledge is within you and located in you, and that when you die, your soul is reincarnated into a new body. So, that shock of the birth, as I said, causes you to forget everything. So you're not learning new facts, but you are unforgetting what you already knew. So, to sum up, Plato was a dualist who believed in reincarnation. So let's turn to Aristotle. Aristotle was the student of Plato, and he disagreed with Plato, which is very helpful because we can use him as a comparison. He said that there is a soul and there is a body, and that they are closely united with each other. Now, on the one hand, this would make him a dualist because he believes in two things, a mind or a soul and a body. However, he sits also somewhere in the middle, and Aristotle is debated as to exactly what you can call him in this particular field. So, for example, he rejects the materialist approach because he thinks it doesn't do justice to the formal and final causes which animate the soul. Now, you may know that for Aristotle, he came up with 4 types of causes, and 2 of them are mentioned here. A formal cause is the essence of an object, what makes it up. And a final cause is the telos, the end purpose of an object, why it exists. And what he's saying here is that if you just believe that a person is physical only and that there isn't a soul or a mind, truly, and that you are made up purely of physical matter and substance, then it's very difficult to make sense of that part of you which seems to be animated. So your emotions, your reason, your intellect, etc. And it doesn't do justice to find out why you have these things, what's its purpose, what makes you that way. But on the other hand, he also rejects Plato's view of the world of forms, and that's because he says that doesn't do justice to sense experience, and that's because this world isn't the real world. It's not the perfect world of forms, in which case, how do you make sense of the natural experiences that you have of this world? So he wasn't a materialist in the one hand, but he also rejected aspects of Plato's dualism. Now, this is where Aristotle becomes clearer, but it's still a bit difficult to pin him down entirely. When the body dies, so does the soul. So he rejects the materialist view, but he also believes that your soul and your body are inseparable, that one needs the other to survive. So he doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul here. This is why it's useful to use as a comparison to Plato. And he gives us an analogy of wax. He says the best way to think about it is that when you put a stamp to the hot wax, it makes an impression on it, it impresses upon it. And that shape is inseparable from the wax itself, in the same way that your soul is inseparable from the body, from the person. Well, let's turn to Descartes. Descartes is also a dualist, but his views are more in line with Christianity to some extent, but not necessarily traditional Christianity, as we will see. So he argued, as a dualist, that you're made up of 2 things, the body and the mind, and he was very clear that the body is spatial. It fills space, it's physical matter, and it doesn't have a conscience. It's not conscious. But the mind is non-spatial. It doesn't fill any particular physical space. And it is conscious. It has feelings and thoughts. And you can't physically locate them in terms of being able to see them. Although Descartes did have a theory, which we'll come to at the end. So the mind and the body are separate. However, they still interact. So the state of the body affects the mind, and the mind affects the body, and vice versa. Now, he was a substance dualist, and that's because he says that the essence of who you are is the mind. And that is a non-physical substance. And that is certain to you. And you then have a body, a different substance that is physical. Now, he argued that he could think away every aspect of himself except the act of thought itself. And this was when Descartes went through this painstaking phase when he imagined a demon on his shoulder whispering in his ear that he's not really real, that he doesn't exist. And he went through a terrible time of actually doubting his own existence, that the outside world, including his body, was indeed real. And it was only when he came to the conclusion, with his famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, that he said, I think, therefore I am. You see, this meant that he was able to be certain that he existed, that the demon on his shoulder was only there because he thought he was there, that he therefore must exist because he thinks he does. And this really comes down to the fact that you can imagine yourself without a body, but you can't imagine yourself as existing without conscious awareness. In other words, try right now, pause and think about whether or not you can imagine yourself not existing. It's impossible to do that and not exist, because the very fact you're thinking about yourself not existing means you're consciously aware of your own existence. And that was the light switch coming on for Descartes. And therefore you can be disembodied and be aware of the real you. So you don't need a body to survive death. So the mind is one kind of substance and the body is another kind of substance. That's substance dualism. The body is something controlled by the mind and is external to it. Descartes had a couple of ideas. One of them was that he weighs 150 pounds, and that's the same as saying that on the way here you had a puncture. And that's because he sees the body as being outside of who he is. It's external to his mind, to who he is. He did randomly believe that the mind is located in the pineal gland of the brain. And he believed your body is a machine with muscles as the pulleys. But it's controlled by your mind, but it's external to it. So then we turn to some ideas that would critique dualism. So we look at Gilbert Ryle. He was a British philosopher known for criticizing specifically Descartes, known as Cartesian dualism. He came up with this amusing idea of a ghost in the machine, just like this picture. That's because for Descartes, the mind is controlling the body. And Ryle used this to show how it seems to be not quite the reality. He uses this to describe Descartes' view of the mind and body, but he criticizes the idea that the mind is separate from the body. And what he simply argues is that it's a category mistake to talk about the mind and the body as substances. He thinks it's wrong to separate the mind from the substance of the body. This might be similar to the likes of Bertrand Russell and Hume, who argue that to talk of God as the conclusive answer to an inductive reasoning is a category mistake, categorizing something in the wrong place. So, for Gilbert Ryle, it's wrong to talk about the mind being separate from the body. So then we move to thinking about some more specifically religious ideas, in particular Christianity. This also relates in some way to Islam, which believes in a resurrection too of the dead on Judgment Day. But having thought about the nature of the mind and the body, the soul and the body and its relationship, and whether you're a dualist or whether you're monist in your ideas, let's turn to the resurrection, which is returning to life after the occurrence of death. And this best example is probably Jesus in the Christian faith, most famous resurrection story, where there is a bodily resurrection. And this is where the physical body gets resurrected by God. And Jesus wasn't a ghost in the Bible when he appeared to his disciples. We know that this body he had when he came back to life 3 days after he had died was able to walk through a wall because the door was closed in the room while all the disciples were there and Jesus just appeared to them. However, when Thomas, who doubted that Jesus was real and thought he was seeing an apparition or a ghost, he reached out and physically touched Jesus and put his hands where the holes in the marks were from when he was tortured. So for Catholics and most traditional Christians, the belief is that everybody that has died will be resurrected on Judgment Day. And those who are destined for heaven will end up with resurrection bodies, just like Jesus's when he came back. And the key differences in the Bible between the resurrected body and this earthly body that we have now are that your resurrected body will be immortal, it will live forever. It is impassible, which means it can no longer suffer like it does now. There will be degrees of glory in heaven. So you will have different states and powers, if you like, with your resurrected body, based on perhaps how you're rewarded from what you've done on earth and your faith. And it will be ruled by the soul. And there are other Christians, you might say a bit like René Descartes, who believe in a completely spiritual resurrection, which doesn't have a body, so disembodied existence. And so there'll be some discussion within Christianity about that. But traditional Christianity, and similarly in Islamic belief, which is the reason why Muslims bury the dead in this sense, is because you need a body for the resurrection. Well, that leads us on to John Hick and his replica theory, because there is a problem with this from a practical point of view. If your body is in the grave and you're buried, it will decay and it will rot and you will be a bag of bones. Perhaps unless you're mummified, like in ancient Egypt. So, what do you do about that? Does God have to recreate your body? Well, John Hick created a thought experiment called Replica Theory. And it was used by him to answer this very question. He argues that we cannot conceive of an individual without the body. Therefore, if there is an afterlife, there must be a body. But he's got to come up with a thought experiment to help us make sense of it. It's worth noting that Hick himself doesn't necessarily, as a Christian, he didn't necessarily as a Christian subscribe to this. So he uses 3 different scenarios regarding the death of a man that he made up called John Smith. I'm not going to go through the 3 different scenarios, but in each of these scenarios, there are replicas of this man that keep appearing, and the replica has the same DNA, the same memories, everything that the original John Smith had. In one of them, he disappears and goes off to the other side of the world, and another 2 of them, he's dead, he's died. Now, he poses the question in each of these scenarios as to whether or not we would accept the new replica as being John Smith, because it comes down to the question of personal identity. Can the replica be the same? And he argues that the replica can. And that's because in the 3rd scenario, Hick asks us to imagine that when John Smith dies, his replica is in another world and created in another world altogether. That's the resurrection world. And so he said, if we can accept that these strange scenarios are logically possible, then it's logically possible for John Smith to die and for a replica of him to appear in some place where there are resurrected beings. And that makes life after death a meaningful idea. And because God is all-powerful, he can do anything. Now, this is what Hick used to try and support Christian teaching in the Bible. It also fits well with his soul-making theodicy, because Hick believed that this life, your soul is not completely made, and so it requires a process into a new life, into another life, for it to continue. And by stipulating only one replica at a time, what Hick does is avoid the potential problem of dualism within identity, and that would have created a paradox. So Hick deals with a lot of these problems with the resurrection. However, Peter Vardy says that there's an issue with how valuable the original is compared to the replica. Now, the new John Smith, he argues, would not have the same value as the old one. And also the philosopher Brian Davis says that this argument doesn't actually offer much comfort, partly because it's a thought experiment, and also partly because do you really want to be not yourself but a different person to the original you? And it's not that easy to accept. There are some other alternative ideas, such as reincarnation, that we've previously mentioned, where Plato himself believes in reincarnation, in the Hindu faith. And in the Hindu faith, the religion of Sanatana Dharma, the scriptures, known as the Vedas, have teachings on reincarnation. They believe that life is a continuous chain of life and death known as samsara. It's the cycle of life. And they believe that your soul, known as the Atman, is independent of the body. Well, that makes them dualist, because the body can die, but the Atman is immutable. It doesn't die and it doesn't change. They believe in something called karma, and therefore your good and your bad actions over many, many life cycles, if good enough, if enough good karma is achieved, your Atman will eventually achieve moksha. That's when your soul is unified with the supreme God Brahman. This is freedom for Hindus because the process of samsara and reincarnation is a form of suffering. So, there is some evidence here, perhaps, of an afterlife. And reincarnation is usually considered when people experience déjà vu. And this word in French means already seen. It's a feeling that you have been somewhere before or experienced something like this before. And some people use that to argue that that's evidence of reincarnation. There's also case studies of children. There's a great documentary called The Boy Who Lived Before. And on that documentary, there's a boy in Scotland, in Glasgow, who, from a very young age, very descriptively tells the story of his previous family. The criticisms of reincarnation are that there's a lack of verifiable evidence for any of this. And there's also a moral issue with karma. For example, your next life, or one of your lives, if it's not a good quality life, let's say perhaps you're born with a disability or something which inhibits you, karma suggests that it's because of bad things that you've done in the past. Another alternative idea about the mind and the body is rebirth. And this is not to be confused with reincarnation. Rebirth is a Buddhist concept. From the outset, it's worth remembering that Buddhists don't typically believe in a supreme deity, in a god. Now, upon death, the mind and the body is given a new body and is born again. But there is no aspect of the previous being transferred to the new one. So, unlike reincarnation, there is no soul here. And the analogy that's used in Buddhism is to consider a candle. It's like lighting one candle from another candle, during which no substance travels from one to the other. But there is an impression from that transferal. So the end of the cycle of rebirth is called nirvana. And this is a transcendent state when you've reached the place of freedom from dukkha, from suffering. And to get this, you've got to understand the nature of an ultimate reality, that there is something bigger and greater than yourself. Now, this involves fully embracing and understanding the nature of suffering, the nature of impermanence, that things in this world don't last forever, and anatta, which is the belief that there is no soul. These are the three marks of Buddhist existence. So, to summarize, in Buddhism, there is no self, this personal identity. There is no soul. Life is constantly changing, and it's your mental processes that continue into the next life, and they carry impressions from this one. And this raises one major criticism of rebirth. If there isn't a soul, how is continuity from the old life to the new life even possible? So there's a big question mark here about the continuation of an afterlife in Buddhist thinking. Finally, we come to near-death experiences as perhaps evidence of an afterlife, of the immortality of the soul. And these are experiences which a large number of individuals have had, when they experience death and then come back to life, or they come really, really close to dying. They claim to have experienced something beyond death, and they testify to this as fact. Raymond Moody, who's an American philosopher, a psychiatrist, a doctor, talked and has done extensively in his career since the 1970s about the afterlife, and in particular near-death experiences, and through hundreds of case studies identified 9 features of a near-death experience. And here's just a select few of them that you can talk about. Having an outer body experience. So this is when you perhaps come out of your body. So someone who I know called Ian McCormack has a fantastic story as a Christian of him when he was younger being stung on the coast of Mauritius by box jellyfish, which were deadly creatures. And he was stung multiple times in his body where the toxic poison was going to his heart at a rapid rate. Eventually, when he made it to the hospital, on the hospital bed, he died. And then he talks about seeing himself floating out of his body and looking down at what was going on. That's an outer body experience. You can look up his story online. The idea of a tunnel, a bit like this picture here. Often people talk in common terms about seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Other people talk about having a life review, a life flashing before their very eyes. Other people might talk about a real deep sense of peace that overwhelms them. And light often comes up. It could be seeing a being of light. So for example, when Ian McCormack, as part of his story, talks about finding himself entering this paradise before he came back into his body. He was met by this being, by this man, who he couldn't see the face of, but he believed it to be Jesus, and there was a light shining directly at him. Having said this, there are alternative explanations to near-death experiences. It could be anesthetics that are often used in a hospital when somebody is dying or they're being operated on and then they die and then they come back. The anesthetics could have been creating this hallucination. Hypoxia, which is a term used when your brain is starved of not enough oxygen. And this can cause all manner of hallucinations and delirium. Or, just as in religious experience, you could talk about temporal lobe epilepsy. That is the part of your brain which is the temporal lobes which are stimulating. And when they're stimulated, they can sometimes cause what seems to be a very similar religious experience or encounter. And that sums up the topic of life after death.